Bus driver forces black woman to sit at the back, but karma strikes just 3 minutes later. The city bus groaned to a halt on a busy downtown street, its doors hissing open as commuters lined the sidewalk, bundled against the early morning chill. Among them was Evelyn Carter, a neatly dressed woman in her early 70s. Her posture was straight, head held high, and her eyes sparkled with quiet determination. She clutched her purse tightly as she stepped aboard, nodding politely to the driver, Robert Whitman. Before we dive deeper into this gripping story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Epic Story Moments. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Like, share, and comment to support more incredible stories like this. Whitman barely looked at her, his scowl deepening as Evelyn dropped her coins into the fare box and paused to adjust her balance before moving forward. "Hurry up," he barked, his voice grating and impatient. Evelyn glanced at him briefly but said nothing, choosing instead to make her way toward an empty seat near the front. She grasped the pole and steadied herself as the bus jerked into motion, her eyes scanning the quiet faces around her. "Not there," Whitman called out sharply, loud enough to cut through the silence. Evelyn stopped mid-step, turning slowly to face him. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "You don't sit there," Whitman sneered. "Seats up front aren't for you. Back of the bus." A hushed tension fell over the passengers. A young woman near the window lowered her gaze nervously, pulling her toddler closer. An older man shifted uncomfortably, his newspaper suddenly fascinating. Evelyn's calm expression didn't falter. She took a measured step forward. "I've paid my fare," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I'll sit where I please." Without warning, Whitman slammed the brakes, the bus lurching violently. Passengers grabbed at poles and seats to steady themselves. The driver stood abruptly, pointing a finger at Evelyn. "You don't make the rules here, lady. Either you move to the back or you're off this bus. Your choice." A murmur rippled through the passengers, a mix of surprise and unease. A young man in the middle row pulled out his phone, the faint glow of its camera light visible as he began recording. Evelyn straightened her shoulders, meeting Whitman's glare. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. Whitman's face reddened with fury. "We'll see about that," he spat, grabbing the radio from his console and calling for transit security. The tension thickened as all eyes turned toward Evelyn, waiting to see what would happen next. The bus remained idle on the crowded street, the low hum of its engine filling the tense silence. Evelyn Carter stood firm, fingers lightly gripping the cold silver rail near the front. The passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their whispers growing louder as the confrontation dragged on. "I'm not going to repeat myself," Robert Whitman barked, stepping out from behind the driver's seat. His uniform stretched tightly over his broad shoulders, his face flushed with irritation. "Move to the back of the bus, or I'll have you removed." Evelyn looked up at him, her expression calm but unyielding. "I've done nothing wrong. I paid my fare. I'll sit where I please." Whitman's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You think you're special? I make the rules on this bus. If I tell you to move, you move." A murmur rippled through the passengers. A young mother near the front shifted uncomfortably, pulling her squirming toddler onto her lap. An older man in a suit adjusted his tie, his gaze fixed firmly out the window. A teenage girl whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "This is ridiculous." Evelyn didn't raise her voice, but her words carried across the bus. "I'm not breaking any rules. What you're doing is wrong, and you know it." The driver's face twisted with fury. "You don't get to tell me what's right. You're disturbing everyone else here. People are trying to get to work." He gestured broadly at the passengers, expecting their support. The majority remained silent, avoiding eye contact. From the middle of the bus, a young man with earbuds dangling from his ears raised his phone slightly, the faint red light now visible as he began recording more intently. The atmosphere on the bus was thick with anticipation, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. The faint light of a recording illuminated the bus as a young man spoke up. "You're the one holding us up, man," he said loudly. "She's just trying to sit." Whitman's glare snapped to the young man. "Stay out of it. This isn't your concern." Undeterred, the young man leaned back in his seat and continued filming. The bus jerked slightly as Whitman stomped back to his seat, grabbing the radio. His voice crackled through the speaker as he called in his complaint. "Dispatch, this is Route 23. I have a passenger refusing to comply, requesting transit security at my location." The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. "She's not doing anything wrong," a woman near the back muttered, her voice barely audible. "Why is he making such a fuss?" Evelyn turned to face the other passengers, her gaze sweeping across their hesitant faces. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "It's about what's right." "Spare us the speech," Whitman snapped, cutting her off. "You're off this bus the second security gets here." A little boy sitting with his mother tugged on her sleeve. "Why is the driver yelling at her mommy?" he asked in a loud whisper. The mother hushed him quickly, glancing nervously at Whitman. Evelyn smiled gently at the child. "Sometimes people don't like being challenged when they know they're wrong," she said softly. "Don't talk to him." Whitman barked, his voice booming. His frustration seemed to grow with every passing moment. The passengers flinched as his outburst echoed through the bus. The young man with the phone spoke up again, his voice steady. "You're digging yourself into a hole, man. Everyone's going to see this." Whitman glared at him but said nothing, his jaw tightening. The faint sound of a siren began to pierce the tense atmosphere, signaling the arrival of transit security. Evelyn didn't move. Her calm, steady presence stood in stark contrast to the chaos Whitman seemed determined to create. The passengers fell silent, their eyes darting between Evelyn and the driver. The bus door hissed open as Whitman prepared for the arrival of the officers. Evelyn remained poised, her shoulders back and chin held high. "We'll see what they have to say," she said quietly. Her words filled with quiet defiance as the sound of the siren grew louder. The tension on the bus reached its breaking point. Everyone waited, the weight of the moment pressing down on them like a heavy, unrelenting tide. The siren grew louder, cutting through the uneasy silence inside the bus. Evelyn Carter stood firm, her hand still resting on the silver rail. Robert Whitman returned to his seat but kept shooting glances at her, his expression a mix of frustration and defiance. The other passengers murmured, quietly among themselves, the tension thick enough to weigh down the already stale air. Finally, a young mother with a toddler seated a few rows back broke the silence. "Why doesn't she just move?" she muttered under her breath, though her words carried enough weight to be heard. "This is holding everyone up. I would have moved." The man next to her chimed in, his voice low but tinged with irritation. "Not worth the fight." Evelyn turned her head slightly in their direction. "Some fights are worth it," she said simply, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. She met the mother's gaze briefly before returning her focus to the front of the bus. The young man with the phone leaned forward. "She's got a point. Why is he even bothering her in the first place? There's nothing wrong with sitting up front." Whitman shot him a sharp glare, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Stay in your lane, kid. This doesn't concern you, doesn't it?" The man shot back, his tone steady. "You're making it everyone's business by stopping the bus." Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. A teenage girl sitting a few rows ahead of Evelyn whispered to the woman beside her, "I can't believe this is happening. It's like something out of a history book." "Yeah," the woman replied, her voice low. "But it's not history. It's now." The faint sound of footsteps approached as the siren wail tapered off. Transit security was here. The bus door hissed open, and two officers stepped on board, their dark uniforms making a stark contrast against the bus's dim interior. The officers' uniforms stood out sharply against the bright morning sunlight streaming through the bus windows. As they stepped aboard, Whitman shot to his feet, his frustration boiling over. Finally, she's been refusing to comply, he said, jabbing a finger at Evelyn. She's holding up the bus and causing a scene. The officers turned their attention to Evelyn, their faces neutral. One of them began, his voice measured. "Ma'am, we've been called because you're refusing to follow the driver's instructions. Can you tell us what's going on?" Evelyn stood her ground, her voice calm but unwavering. "I paid my fare like everyone else," she replied, her eyes locked on the officers. "He demanded I move to the back of the bus for no reason other than his own prejudice." "That's not true," Whitman interjected, his voice rising. "I told her these seats are priority seats. She doesn't belong here." "Priority for who?" Evelyn countered, her gaze sharp. "The elderly? I certainly qualify. Or are there other criteria I'm unaware of?" The officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. The passengers watched intently, a few nodding at Evelyn's words. The young man with the phone tilted it slightly, ensuring he caught the officers, Whitman, and Evelyn all in frame. "Ma'am, the easiest thing would be to move to another seat," the second officer said, his tone placating. "We're just trying to resolve this without further delay." "I'm not the one delaying the bus," Evelyn replied coolly. "He is. If I step off now, he'll think he can keep treating people this way. And he'll be right." A teenage girl, who had whispered earlier, suddenly stood up. "She's right," she said loudly, her voice trembling but resolute. "Why should she have to move? He's the one being a jerk." "Sit down," Whitman barked, his frustration boiling over. "You want to get thrown off, too?" "That's enough," the first officer said sharply, raising a hand to calm the driver. "Sir, we'll handle this." The young man with the phone spoke up again, his tone defiant. "Everyone's already seen what you're doing, man. This video is going to be everywhere by tonight." The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. A man in a suit near the back, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "Look, this is ridiculous. She hasn't done anything wrong. Just let her stay where she is, and we can all get moving." Whitman's face turned a deeper shade of red, his hands clenching into fists. "You people don't get it. Rules are rules. You can't just let anyone sit up here." "Anyone?" Evelyn's voice cut through the chaos. "Or just people who look like me." The bus fell silent again, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly aware of the tension growing outside. Pedestrians began to gather near the bus, curious about the commotion. The young man with the phone turned his camera toward the crowd, capturing their growing interest. "We need to make a decision," the second officer said, his voice tight. "Ma'am, are you willing to step off the bus so we can de-escalate the situation?" Evelyn straightened her shoulders, her expression unyielding. "No," she replied firmly. "I've done nothing wrong, and I won't be treated like this. Not today." The officers hesitated, caught between the calm defiance of an elderly woman and the fiery tension of an increasingly agitated bus driver. Whitman shook his head, muttering under his breath, and returned to his seat. The atmosphere inside the bus was electric, every passenger on edge as the standoff continued. Outside, more people gathered, their murmurs blending with the faint sounds of car horns and distant chatter. Evelyn didn't move. Her quiet dignity spoke louder than any argument could. She stood as a pillar of resolve in the chaos, refusing to back down from the injustice thrust upon her. The crowd outside the bus grew larger, their curious murmurs floating through the open doors. Inside, the tension simmered. Evelyn remained steady, her posture unyielding. The officers exchanged uncertain looks, unsure how to proceed. One officer sighed and turned back to Whitman. "Sir, what exactly are you asking us to do here? She's not being aggressive or posing a threat." Whitman threw up his hands in frustration. "Are you serious? She's refusing to follow instructions. I can't do my job with someone like her up here, disrupting everything." A young woman near the middle of the bus, her voice quivering but defiant, called out, You're the one making the scene, not her." Several passengers murmured in agreement. The teenage girl who had spoken earlier stood up again, her hands clutching the edge of the seat for balance. "Yeah, she's just sitting there. What's the big deal?" Whitman's glare shot toward the young woman who had spoken up. "You want me to throw you off too?" he sneered. "Sit down and stay out of it." The officer raised a hand, trying to calm him. "Let's keep this civil," he said, his voice firm but tinged with exhaustion. He turned back to Evelyn. "Ma'am, are you sure you won't consider just moving to another seat? It might make things easier for everyone." Evelyn's gaze never wavered. "I've done nothing wrong. If I move, it'll be easier for him, not everyone. And I won't give him the satisfaction." The tension shattered with the loud chime of a phone. The young man who had been recording the incident smirked, holding up his phone triumphantly. "Looks like it's already online," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Over 1,000 views in 5 minutes." Whitman's face darkened, his jaw clenched, his anger bubbling to the surface. "You put this on the internet," he growled, his voice low but menacing. "Damn right I did," the young man replied undeterred. "People need to see this. You can't treat people like this and think you'll get away with it." A ripple of approval spread through the passengers. Even those who had been silent murmured in agreement. The man in the suit near the back of the bus finally spoke up, his voice calm but sharp. "This isn't 1955. She has every right to sit where she wants." Whitman slammed his fist onto the dashboard, the loud thud cutting through the air, silencing the murmurs. "I've had it," he shouted. "She's off this bus, or we're not going anywhere." The officers stiffened at his tone, their patience wearing thin. The first officer stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Sir, if you keep escalating this, you're going to be the one facing consequences. You called us here to handle the situation. Let us do our job." Outside, the crowd began to swell, their voices growing louder. People pressed closer to the bus, some raising their phones to record the scene. A man in a construction vest called out, "What's going on in there? Why isn't the bus moving? The driver's being a racist jerk." Someone yelled from the back of the bus, drawing laughter and cheers from the growing crowd. The second officer rubbed his temples, clearly feeling the pressure. He turned back to Evelyn, his tone softer but still urging. "Ma'am, I understand your position, and I don't blame you, but this is getting bigger by the minute. Are you sure you want to keep this going?" Evelyn glanced at the crowd outside. Their faces were a mix of curiosity and growing outrage. Her eyes swept over the passengers. Some watched her with sympathy, others with exasperation. Finally, she looked at the young man recording the incident and gave him a small nod. "Yes," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. "I'm sure. This isn't about me. It's about what's right." The officer straightened, nodding in reluctant acknowledgement. "All right, ma'am. Then we'll stay until we can resolve this properly." Whitman let out a derisive laugh. "You're just going to let her get away with this? Unbelievable." The officer turned sharply toward him. "One more outburst, and I'll have you reported for misconduct." Whitman fell silent, his face a mask of barely contained rage. The tension in the bus was electric, every passenger hanging on the edge of their seats. Outside, the crowd grew louder, their voices forming a rhythmic chant that drifted through the open doors. "Let her sit. Let her sit." Evelyn finally took her seat near the front, her head held high. Her quiet defiance seemed to radiate strength, a stark contrast to Whitman's growing agitation. The officers exchanged a final glance before stepping outside to address the crowd, leaving the driver fuming and the passengers buzzing with murmurs of approval. The young man with the phone grinned, lowering it briefly to address Evelyn. "You're a legend, ma'am," he said, his voice full of admiration. "This video's going to blow up." Evelyn gave him a faint smile but said nothing, her focus still locked on Whitman. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, the tide seemed to be turning in her favor. The officers stepped off the bus, the weight of the growing crowd pressing down on the already simmering tension inside. The chant outside had grown louder, echoing through the open doors. Let her sit. Let her sit. Passengers exchanged glances, their unease now mingling with curiosity. Evelyn sat poised, her back straight, her gaze fixed ahead. She could feel Whitman's glare boring into her from his seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The young man with the phone held it up again, panning across the passengers to capture their reactions. "You see this," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This is what standing up looks like. Y'all better remember her face, because she's making history right now." Whitman snapped his head toward the young man, fury in his eyes. "Turn that damn thing off," he barked. "You're disrupting this bus just as much as she is." The young man smirked. "Disrupting? Nah, I'm documenting. There's a difference." Another passenger, a middle-aged woman with a worn leather bag, spoke up for the first time. "Honestly, we should all be documenting this," she said, her voice calm but firm. "He's treating her like garbage for no reason." Whitman turned his attention to her, his anger spilling over. "Lady, you don't know what you're talking about. I've been driving this route for years, and I know how to handle troublemakers." "Troublemaker?" The teenage girl from earlier shot back, standing again despite Whitman's earlier threats. "She's literally just sitting there. How's that trouble? You all want to play hero?" Whitman barked, his voice rising again. "Fine, but don't come crying to me when this bus doesn't move." From the back of the bus, a man in a suit stood. His face was calm, but his voice firm. "We've all been sitting here long enough. If you can't handle this professionally, maybe you shouldn't be driving." Whitman's face turned crimson. "You think you can do my job better, pal? Be my guest." "Maybe I would, if it meant treating people like humans," the man retorted, sitting back down. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the bus. Outside, the chant grew louder, joined by the occasional car horn as drivers slowed to observe the scene. The commotion outside was deafening. The officers stood by the door, desperately trying to manage the swelling crowd. A reporter with a camera pushed her way to the front, the red recording light visible through the bus's grimy window. Whitman, now visibly rattled, grabbed the radio again. "Dispatch, this is Route 23. Situation's getting worse. There's a crowd outside now. We need more officers." The radio crackled back. "Additional units are en route. Hold tight." Evelyn let out a quiet breath, her composure unshaken. She glanced at the young man still filming. "You should focus on what's happening outside, too," she said softly. "This is bigger than just this bus." He nodded and angled his phone toward the crowd, capturing the chanting and the faces of those demanding justice. "You're right," he said, "but you're still the star here." Whitman slammed his hand onto the dashboard, the sound startling some of the passengers. "Enough. I'm sick of this circus. Everyone who has a problem with me, get off my bus. Right now." No one moved. The teenage girl crossed her arms defiantly, her eyes locked on the driver. The man in the suit near the back continued staring out the window, unfazed. The young mother clutched her child tighter, but remained silent. Even those who had been reluctant earlier now seemed rooted to their seats, their quiet solidarity a stark rebuke to the driver's outburst. Evelyn turned her head slowly, her voice low, but carrying through the bus. "You don't get to decide who belongs here. That's not your job." Whitman's mouth opened as if to retort, but he hesitated. His jaw tightened, and for the first time, his authority seemed to slip from his grasp. He knew it. The chants outside were growing louder, the crowd swelling into a small sea of people. Phones and cameras were pointed toward the bus, capturing every moment. One of the officers re-entered the bus, his face tight with frustration. "Driver," he said firmly, "we need to de-escalate this now. The crowd's growing, and the media's here. This situation is out of control." Whitman scoffed, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "Oh, so now it's my fault? I told you how to handle this. Get her off the bus." The officer shook his head. "No. If we try to force her off now, it's going to cause an even bigger problem. The crowd's not on your side. A faint smile tugged at the corners of Evelyn's lips as she turned her attention back to the window. Signs had begun to appear in the crowd. One read, "Justice for Evelyn," and another scrawled hastily on cardboard simply said, "End the hate?" Whitman sank into his seat, his face a mask of fury and helplessness. Evelyn remained calm, her presence unshaken. The energy in the bus shifted. The passengers no longer felt like mere observers. They were witnesses to something far greater than a morning commute. The officer turned to Evelyn, his voice softer. "Ma'am, we're working on resolving this. Just stay seated." She nodded, folding her hands in her lap. "I wasn't planning on moving." The officer exited the bus again, and Whitman sat in smoldering silence. The noise from the crowd outside was now deafening, a chorus of voices calling for justice. Inside the bus, the passengers seemed to sit a little straighter, their nervous energy replaced by quiet resolve. The world was watching, and Evelyn Carter was at the center of it all. The officer's voice crackled from his radio outside, trying to manage the growing crowd. Inside the bus, the tension had reached a breaking point. Whitman sat stiffly in his seat, glaring at Evelyn. His fingers tapped impatiently against the steering wheel, each motion sharper than the last. Evelyn remained composed, her chin high as she stared out the window at the sea of faces demanding justice. The chants outside, "Let her sit, let her sit," echoed louder, reverberating through the walls of the bus. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Whitman growled, his voice barely contained. He stood abruptly, the chair creaking under his force. "You're not. You're just another troublemaker, making my life harder." Evelyn didn't flinch. Her calm demeanor seemed to amplify his anger. "What I am," she said, her voice steady, "is someone who's tired of being pushed around. If you can't handle that, maybe you're in the wrong job." Whitman's face flushed crimson. "That's it. I'm done playing nice." He stalked toward her, veins pulsing in his neck with barely restrained rage. The passengers gasped, several shouting in protest. "What are you doing?" the teenage girl cried, standing halfway in her seat. "You can't do that." "Don't touch her," yelled the young man with the phone, angling his camera to capture Whitman's every move. Whitman ignored them all, his focus solely on Evelyn. He loomed over her, his large frame blocking out the light from the windows. "I told you to get off my bus," he snarled, his breath hot. "And if you won't do it yourself, I'll make you." Evelyn's expression didn't waver. "You lay one finger on me," she said quietly but with a deadly edge, "and you'll regret it." The warning didn't deter him. In one swift movement, Whitman grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her halfway out of the seat. The passengers erupted in outrage, several leaping to their feet. "Stop him," someone shouted. The young man recording bolted forward, his phone still trained on the scene. "Let her go," he yelled, his voice sharp, but Whitman shoved him back with his free hand, sending him stumbling into another seat. Evelyn winced but refused to cry out. Her resolve remained unshaken, even as Whitman dragged her farther from her seat. "This is assault," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. "You're not above the law, no matter what you think." The doors of the bus slammed open, and two officers charged inside. "Stop right now," one of them barked, his hand instinctively reaching for his belt. "Driver, let her go." Whitman froze but didn't immediately release her. His head whipped toward the officers, a dangerous mix of anger and defiance flashing in his eyes. "She's disrupting my bus. I'm just doing my job." "Job." The officer's voice was cold. "That's not your job." He stepped forward. "And if you don't let her go this second, you're going to be in cuffs." Whitman hesitated, just a fraction of a second, before releasing Evelyn's arm. She settled back into her seat, her composure still intact despite the ordeal. The officer turned to her, concern flashing across his face. "Ma'am, are you all right?" "I'm fine," Evelyn said, smoothing her sleeve. Her voice was steady, but her eyes never left Whitman. The second officer stepped forward, his handcuffs gleaming in the light. "Driver, you're under arrest for assault. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." "What?" Whitman roared, his voice echoing through the bus. "You can't be serious. I'm the one in charge here." "Not anymore," the officer replied coldly, grabbing Whitman's arm and spinning him around, locking the cuffs into place. Whitman struggled, but the officer's grip was firm. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The passengers watched in stunned silence as Whitman was marched down the aisle. His protests were drowned out by the chants from outside. "This is ridiculous," he yelled, craning his neck to glare at Evelyn. "You will regret this, lady." Evelyn's voice was calm, but cutting as she broke her silence. "I think the only one with regrets here will be you." The officer guided Whitman down the bus steps and out into the arms of the growing crowd, where cameras and phones flashed in every direction. The reporter outside shouted questions as Whitman was loaded into a waiting police car, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and disbelief. Inside the bus, the passengers erupted into applause. The teenage girl clapped loudly, her grin wide. "Finally, some justice," she exclaimed. The young man with the phone turned back to Evelyn, still recording. "Ma'am, that was incredible. Everyone's going to see this." Evelyn gave him a faint smile, her composure softening for the first time. "Good. Maybe it'll make people think twice about staying silent." The officer who had arrested Whitman stepped back onto the bus, addressing Evelyn directly. "Ma'am, we're going to make sure this gets properly documented. Do you want to press charges?" Evelyn nodded firmly. "Absolutely." The officer tipped his hat slightly. "We'll handle the rest from here. You just sit tight." As the officer exited, the crowd outside cheered. Their chants shifted to her name. Evelyn Carter had become the face of defiance. Quiet yet powerful, standing tall against injustice. The bus doors closed, and the replacement driver, a young woman with kind eyes, climbed aboard. She glanced at Evelyn and smiled. "Where to next?" she asked, her tone light but respectful. Evelyn relaxed into her seat, her shoulders finally easing. She looked out the window for a moment, then said simply, The police cruiser carrying Robert Whitman sped away from the scene, its sirens wailing faintly as it disappeared down the street. The crowd outside the bus erupted into cheers, their voices echoing in unison. Inside, the energy shifted. The passengers, who had been wary and hesitant before, now buzzed with a mix of relief and triumph. Evelyn Carter remained seated at the front, her posture as poised as ever. She rubbed her arm where Whitman had grabbed her, her hand lingering for just a moment before returning to her lap. The young man with the phone moved closer, his recording still running. "Ma'am, you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. His voice softer than before. The defiance he'd shown to Whitman had given way to genuine concern. "I'm fine," Evelyn replied, her voice steady. She met his gaze, her tone carrying a quiet strength. "It'll take more than that to shake me." The teenage girl stepped forward, clutching her backpack against her chest. "You were amazing," she said, her eyes wide with admiration. "I can't believe you stood up to him like that." "It wasn't just for me," Evelyn said, her gaze sweeping across the other passengers. "Sometimes you have to take a stand, even if it's uncomfortable." Her words seemed to resonate. The man in the suit, who had remained quiet for much of the ordeal, finally spoke up. "You've got more courage than most people, Mrs. Carter," he said with a small nod. "Evelyn Carter," she corrected him gently. "Well, Mrs. Carter," he continued, "you've inspired all of us today. That man deserved everything he got." The young mother, still holding her child tightly, leaned forward from her seat. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner," she admitted, her voice tinged with guilt. I didn't want to make things worse." Evelyn offered her a kind smile. "It's never easy, especially when fear takes over. But every voice matters. Remember that next time." The young man holding the phone interrupted, turning his screen toward Evelyn. "Your video is already blowing up. I just checked. Tens of thousands of views. People are sharing it everywhere." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, the corner of her lips curling slightly. "Well," she said, "it seems the truth has its way of getting out." Before anyone could respond, the replacement driver, a petite woman with a calm, authoritative demeanor, stepped onto the bus. She adjusted her uniform cap and scanned the faces in the aisle. Her expression was professional, yet kind. "Good morning," she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. "I'll be taking over for the rest of the route. Sorry for the delay, folks." She glanced at Evelyn, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. "Mrs. Carter?" she asked, her tone respectful. Evelyn inclined her head. "Yes, I just want to say thank you," the driver said. "What you did today, it's not just for you. It's for all of us." The bus fell silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone. Evelyn nodded, her gratitude unspoken but evident in her expression. The driver returned to her seat, and the bus hummed to life again, finally moving forward. As they continued their route, the passengers began talking among themselves, sharing their perspectives on what had happened. Some debated how Whitman had kept his job for so long, while others expressed outrage at the system that had allowed his behavior to persist. Evelyn listened quietly, her presence a steady anchor amid the buzz of voices. The young man with the phone eventually sat beside her, lowering his camera for the first time. "What happens next?" he asked. She turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "I press charges," she said firmly, "and then we see where the fight takes us." He nodded slowly. "I think a lot of people are going to want to help. Your video, it's bigger than just this bus." "It has to be," Evelyn replied. "Change doesn't come from silence." The teenage girl, now sitting across from them, leaned forward. "Do you think they'll fire him for good?" Evelyn's lips tightened briefly. "I don't know," she admitted, "but whatever happens to him, I'll make sure people see what he stood for. That's what matters." The bus pulled up to the next stop, and a handful of passengers disembarked. Outside, the crowd had thinned slightly, but a few people remained, waving their signs and cheering. As Evelyn glanced at them through the window, she raised her hand in acknowledgement, a subtle but powerful gesture that drew another wave of applause. As the bus moved on, Evelyn felt a sense of resolve settle over her. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. She knew that much. But for the first time, she felt that the voices around her, once silent, had found strength, and that, she knew, was a victory in itself. The aftermath of the bus altercation spread rapidly. By the next day, Evelyn Carter's name was on everyone's lips. The video taken by the young passenger went viral, garnering millions of views across social media. News stations picked up the story, replaying the footage of Robert Whitman dragging Evelyn from her seat, followed by his subsequent arrest. Public outrage ignited like wildfire, with protests forming outside the city's transit headquarters and hashtags like #JusticeForEvelyn and #EndTransitRacism trending worldwide. Evelyn, however, remained composed as the storm unfolded. She sat in her modest living room, her phone buzzing constantly with calls, texts, and notifications. Reporters clamored for interviews, and activists reached out with offers of support. Despite the noise, Evelyn focused on the next step, holding Whitman and the transit authority accountable. Her lawyer, Angela Martin, arrived at Evelyn's home that afternoon. Her presence exuded a quiet authority, and Evelyn immediately sensed that Angela was the kind of person who could navigate the storm they were about to face. Angela, a sharp-dressed civil rights attorney, sat down across from Evelyn, pulling out a file and glancing through the documents. "Evelyn, we're going to take this one step at a time," she said with a steady voice. "But know that we have the power of the people behind us. This isn't just your fight anymore." Evelyn nodded, her resolve firming. She had taken a stand, and now the fight for justice would only grow stronger. "Steady. carrying the weight of both the case and the public's expectations. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not just about one individual. It's about a systemic failure to protect the rights and dignity of the people who rely on public transportation every day. Robert Whitman's actions were reprehensible, but they were not an isolated incident. They were the result of a culture that allowed racial profiling, verbal abuse, and unchecked power to flourish within the transit system. She paused for a moment, her eyes sweeping across the room, meeting the gaze of the jurors. We will prove that the transit authority, for years, protected this behavior, ignoring complaints and shielding Mr. Whitman from accountability. It's time for that to change. Evelyn sat in silence, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was determined to see this through. Angela's words resonated deeply within her. This wasn't just about seeking justice for herself. It was about creating a ripple effect that would force a reckoning for the larger system that allowed this kind of injustice to continue. The trial proceeded, with each witness painting a clearer picture of Whitman's abusive behavior. The young girl who had spoken out on the bus was the first to testify, her voice trembling slightly but growing in strength as she described the scene. She recounted how Whitman had grabbed Evelyn without provocation, how he had thrown her into the seat, and how, despite Evelyn's calm demeanor, he had continued to escalate the situation. Next, the young man with the phone took the stand. His testimony, along with the video footage, played a pivotal role. The jurors watched intently as the footage rolled, capturing every moment of Evelyn's confrontation with Whitman. The raw footage showed not only the physical altercation, but also the passengers' growing discomfort, their subtle yet significant shift from indifference to vocal support for Evelyn. Evelyn's eyes stayed on the screen, her face unreadable as the video played. It was hard to relive the moment, but she knew it was necessary. She was in this for more than just herself. The middle-aged woman who had initially been hesitant to speak up was the next witness. She told the court about her own experiences with Whitman's behavior, sharing stories of how he had treated other passengers, often with a harsh, discriminatory tone. "I saw it before," she said, her voice breaking, "but I was too scared to say anything. I didn't want to get involved. Now, I know I should have." As the witnesses spoke, it became clear that Whitman's behavior had been both a symptom and a reflection of deeper issues within the transit system. Angela's strategy was clear. It wasn't just about showing that Whitman was guilty. It was about exposing the culture of discrimination that had allowed his behavior to persist unchecked for so long. Meanwhile, Whitman's defense attorney tried to discredit the witnesses and downplay the severity of the situation. Mr. Whitman was simply enforcing the rules, the lawyer argued. He was doing his job. This entire case has been blown out of proportion due to a viral video that doesn't capture the full context of the events. Evelyn clenched her fists in frustration as she listened to the defense. She knew this was coming. They were trying to diminish the reality of what had happened, to make it seem like her pain was a product of misunderstanding or exaggeration. But Evelyn knew the truth. The video told the story. The witnesses confirmed it. And the system that had protected Whitman was now being exposed for what it truly was. Angela leaned over to Evelyn, her voice low but confident. "Don't let them get to you. This is just part of their strategy. They have nothing else to stand on." Evelyn nodded, steeling herself. She had to remain focused. This was bigger than just proving Whitman's guilt. It was about taking down a system that had allowed so much injustice to go unnoticed for so long. As the trial continued, the pressure mounted. The courtroom became a battleground, each side fighting not just for the verdict, but for the future of public transportation policies and the rights of every passenger who relied on the system. Activists outside the courthouse held their ground, chanting for justice, while reporters continued to cover the trial with intensity, feeding the public's growing demand for accountability. With each passing day, the case against Whitman and the transit authority grew stronger. Evelyn's courage had ignited a fire, and now she was ready to see it through to the end. Evelyn continued, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of emotion. I stood my ground not just for me, but for everyone who has been made to feel less than because of their race, their gender, or their socioeconomic status. I knew that if I moved, it would send a message that it was okay to treat people that way. And it's not okay. The courtroom was quiet, the weight of her words settling over everyone. Evelyn could feel the eyes of the jury on her, every person in the room captivated by her calm strength. She didn't need to raise her voice. The truth spoke for itself. Angela, who had been by her side throughout the trial, gave her a subtle nod, acknowledging the power of her testimony. Then she turned to the jury, her voice firm as she reinforced Evelyn's words. What Mrs. Carter did that day was not just a personal act of courage. It was a stand for every person who has ever been told they don't belong, every person who has been treated with disrespect because of who they are. And today, we ask you to hold Mr. Whitman accountable for his actions and to send a message to the transit authority that they can no longer ignore the culture of discrimination that they've allowed to fester for years. The defense attorney attempted to interject, challenging the emotional weight of Evelyn's words, but it was clear that their arguments were losing ground. The jury remained focused, their eyes on Evelyn, and their expressions softened with understanding. When the defense rested its case, the tension in the room was palpable. Angela stood and made her closing remarks. We have presented overwhelming evidence, eyewitness testimony, video footage, and the actions of a woman who, despite being wronged, chose to stand firm and take action. This case is about more than just one assault. It's about breaking the cycle of injustice and ensuring that no one else suffers in silence. Evelyn sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, her thoughts focused. She had done everything she could, and now it was out of her hands. She had spoken the truth, stood her ground, and fought for what was right. Whatever the outcome, she had already won in the hearts of those who had heard her story. The jury deliberated for what felt like hours, but when they returned, their verdict was swift and clear. Guilty. Robert Whitman was held accountable for his actions, and the transit authority was found negligent in their duty to protect the passengers under their care. The courtroom erupted in applause. Evelyn's heart swelled with relief and triumph. It wasn't just her victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. As she walked out of the courthouse, surrounded by the applause of supporters and activists, Evelyn felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had done what she set out to do. The fight wasn't over, but it had been a significant step toward change. Outside, the crowds continued to chant, their voices rising in solidarity. Justice for Evelyn, they called. Accountability now. The signs they carried were more than just protest. They were a message to the world that no one could stand in silence in the face of injustice. Evelyn took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the sea of people. She knew that this was only the beginning, but it was a beginning she could be proud of. She had shown the world that one voice, even in the face of overwhelming odds, could spark a movement. As she walked toward her car, Angela beside her, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. She had fought for herself, for the passengers on that bus, and for anyone who had ever felt powerless. And in doing so, she had become a symbol of what it meant to stand up for what was right. The road ahead was uncertain, but Evelyn Carter knew one thing for sure. She would continue to fight, not just for herself, but for a world where everyone's dignity was respected, and where justice was not just a privilege, but a right for all. Had been involved in multiple prior complaints regarding discriminatory behavior, the representative hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the line of questioning. "We take all complaints seriously," the official replied, but Angela's gaze remained steady. "But isn't it true that these complaints were either dismissed or downplayed? That nothing significant was done to address the issues?" The representative stammered, avoiding eye contact with the jury. We review every incident thoroughly, but sometimes the evidence doesn't support taking further action." Angela's voice was measured but firm. "So, you're telling this court that despite numerous complaints, including explicit allegations of racial profiling and abuse, the transit authority chose to overlook the pattern of behavior exhibited by Mr. Whitman?" The room was silent. the weight of the question hanging in the air. The representative seemed lost for words, his discomfort palpable. "No further questions," Angela said, turning back to the jury, her demeanor unshaken. She had made her point. The transit authority's failure to act on previous complaints was now exposed for all to see, a critical piece of the puzzle that tied the entire case together. Evelyn, watching from her seat, felt a quiet but fierce pride. Angela was unrelenting, connecting the dots and revealing the systemic issues that had allowed someone like Whitman to operate unchecked for so long. The case had shifted from a personal battle to a fight for broader accountability. The trial continued for several more days, with the defense presenting weak counterarguments that failed to discredit the mounting evidence against Whitman and the transit authority. The public continued to rally behind Evelyn, with activists and community leaders showing up daily to support the case. The courtroom, once a place of tension, began to feel more like a stage for a collective stand against injustice. Finally, the closing arguments arrived. Angela, as always, was poised and focused. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here today not just because one man violated another's rights, but because of a system that allowed it to happen over and over again. We ask you not just to seek justice for Mrs. Carter, but to send a message that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated, and that accountability must extend beyond the individual to the institutions that enable them." Evelyn's heart raced as the jury filed out for deliberation. She knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time, she felt a sense of hope that things might truly change. The jury deliberated for several hours, but when they returned, their verdict was clear: guilty. Robert Whitman was found liable for the assault on Evelyn, and the transit authority was held responsible for its failure to address his previous misconduct. The verdict was a landmark moment, a victory not just for Evelyn, but for everyone who had been silenced by systemic injustice. As the courtroom erupted in applause, Evelyn stood, her knees weak but her heart full. Angela, standing beside her, gave her a small smile, her eyes full of pride. "You did it," she whispered. Evelyn nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "We did it." As she walked out of the courthouse, the crowd outside cheered, their voices ringing out in unison. Justice for Evelyn. Accountability now. The fight was far from over, but Evelyn had made sure that the first step toward change had been taken. She had stood up for herself, for others, and for the countless people who had been ignored or mistreated. And in doing so, she had ignited a movement that would continue to demand justice, equality, and a reckoning with the systems of power that allowed people like Robert Whitman to act with impunity. Evelyn's journey was just beginning, but she knew one thing for certain: she would never back down from the fight for justice. And with the truth on her side, she would continue to make sure that no one else would ever have to endure the same kind of injustice that she had. Served. But Evelyn knew that this was just the beginning. The verdict had sent a clear message not only to Robert Whitman, but to the entire system that had allowed his behavior to persist unchecked. The courtroom buzzed with a mixture of relief and anticipation as Evelyn stood, her heart pounding in her chest. Angela, standing beside her, gave her a quiet but proud nod. As they walked out of the courtroom, the crowd outside erupted into applause once more. People cheered for Evelyn's courage, for the justice she had fought so hard to achieve, and for the broader implications of the case. This wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for everyone who had ever felt marginalized, mistreated, or ignored. But even as the cheers rang out, Evelyn knew that there was more work to be done. This case had highlighted the deep flaws in the system, and while one battle had been won, there was a long road ahead to ensure that such behavior would never be tolerated again. She couldn't rest now. The fight for real, lasting change was only just beginning. Angela walked beside her, a steady presence. "You did it, Evelyn. You stood up and you changed things." Evelyn smiled, though the weight of the moment was still heavy on her heart. "We did it, but the work isn't over. This case is just one part of the bigger picture." Angela nodded, understanding the gravity of Evelyn's words. "I know, and we'll keep pushing. But today, we celebrate. And so, as the crowd outside continued to cheer, Evelyn allowed herself a moment of quiet triumph. She had fought for herself, for others, and for justice. And she knew that, with Angela by her side and the strength of her community behind her, there was nothing she couldn't face. As the days passed, Evelyn felt a sense of peace settle over her, though she knew that the road ahead would still require vigilance. The reforms within the transit authority were just a starting point, a small step in the larger fight for equality and justice. Yet, every time she spoke to a group of young students or engaged in a community forum, she felt the impact of her actions reverberating through others. Her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever been overlooked or mistreated. She had become a symbol of courage, and it was humbling to see how much change one individual could spark. Each time she shared her journey, she reminded others that their voices mattered, that standing up for what was right could create real change. On the rare days when the weight of everything threatened to overwhelm her, Evelyn would think back to that moment in the courtroom when the verdict was read. The relief, the triumph, and most importantly, the knowledge that she had done something meaningful kept her going. The fight for justice wasn't just an event. It was a lifelong commitment, and Evelyn had found her place in it. The finality of Robert Whitman's punishment gave her a sense of justice, but the thought of those sweeping reforms made her hopeful. She had stood up to a system that allowed prejudice to thrive, and now that system was being forced to confront its own failures. But Evelyn knew that real change was a continuous process, and she was ready to keep pushing forward. As the weeks turned into months, Evelyn's influence only grew. She became a familiar face in local media, advocating for systemic reforms and working with Angela to ensure that the momentum from the trial didn't fizzle out. Together, they lobbied for policy changes in other sectors and worked to build a network of activists and allies committed to equality and justice. The movement was gaining steam, and Evelyn was at its forefront. But even as her influence grew, she never lost sight of the reason she had started this fight in the first place: to stand up for the dignity of every individual. Each step forward, no matter how small, brought her closer to a future where discrimination had no place. And so, as the world around her changed, Evelyn continued her work with the same quiet strength and fierce determination that had carried her through the trial. She had ignited something larger than herself, and the flame of justice, fueled by her courage, burned brighter with each passing day.